Overnight, people were given just 15 minutes to gather the bare essentials, lock the door, and leave their homes forever. There were no explanations, no trials, no warnings, only the quiet urgency of a knock at the door in the dead of night. Families woke to the sound of officers outside, quietly moving from house to house. In many cases, parents had to carry infants while older children stumbled behind them, still groggy from sleep. Windows rattled in the cold, and the air was thick with confusion, fear, and disbelief. In that brief time, there was no opportunity to pack meaningful belongings, no time to consider what might happen, no chance to say proper goodbyes. Shoes were put on hastily, coats wrapped around children, and the smallest of items, family photographs, a small blanket, a few clothes, were hastily stuffed into whatever bags could be carried. And then they were gone. Entire nations were suddenly declared enemies of the state. Ethnic identity, language, religion, and geography became criminalized by decree. Without trial or evidence, entire communities were labeled suspicious, unreliable, or traitorous. Military explanations arrived at night, wrapped in secrecy, leaving families bewildered and terrified. Officially, it was always framed as a security measure. Certain people were allegedly collaborating with foreign powers, threatening the state, or undermining socialism. In reality, the reasoning was far simpler and far more insidious. The authorities feared those who maintained identities different from the dominant culture, who lived near border regions, or who held allegiances to communities outside Moscow's control. People were treated not as citizens, but as objects to be moved, measured, and controlled. Families were loaded into freight cars, packed tightly, without adequate food or water, without heat or sanitation. Often the elderly were propped up on wooden crates, children clung to parents in fear, and the sick were forced to endure the same conditions as the rest. The journey lasted for days, sometimes weeks, with little information about where they were headed. Many people did not survive the trip. The cold and hunger claimed countless lives before the first settlement was even reached. For those who did survive, the arrival brought only a new set of challenges. They were sent to special settlements, remote areas far from towns, cities, or even other villages, where access to resources was minimal and oversight constant. The resettled populations included Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, Koreans, and others. Entire communities, including the elderly, women, and children, were uprooted at once. They lost their homes, their land, their livelihoods, and their social networks. A young child would find herself in a barren village where her parents' friends, neighbors, and relatives had all been taken elsewhere or killed during the journey. An elder would stand silently in a strange landscape, unable to return to the home they had lived in for decades, stripped of authority, dignity, and the familiar rhythms of life. Life in the special settlements was harsh and often fatal. The land was often unsuitable for farming, the climate extreme, and resources scarce. People were expected to survive and even contribute labor without adequate tools, food, or support. They were denied citizenship rights in practical terms, no passports, no freedom to travel, no political representation. The settlements were under strict surveillance. Guards patrolled constantly, ensuring compliance, and the threat of punishment was ever present. Those who attempted to flee or resist were met with imprisonment, fines, or further relocation. The rationale behind the deportations was control. The state sought to break communities by removing them from their cultural and geographical context. By dispersing entire populations and placing them in harsh conditions, authorities aimed to diminish resistance, erase local traditions, and weaken social cohesion. When a people no longer had roots, the theory went, they could be more easily governed and less likely to challenge the state. In effect, identity itself became a liability. For the deported, the question of survival took precedence over all else. Maintaining language, culture, and family ties became acts of quiet defiance. Children suffered profoundly. Young boys and girls who had never experienced extreme hunger, cold, or fatigue were forced to adapt to conditions no child should endure. Their education ceased. Play was rare and often impossible. Many children developed lifelong health problems due to malnutrition, harsh labor, and the trauma of witnessing parental suffering. Elderly individuals, already vulnerable, often could not survive the arduous journey or the conditions at the settlements. Those who did survive were left weakened, both physically and emotionally, with limited means to rebuild their lives. The psychological impact of the deportations was immense. Families were forced to live in constant fear, uncertainty, and dependence on the authorities. Trust between people and the state was irreparably damaged. Communities that had existed for centuries were fractured. Oral histories and cultural practices were interrupted as people struggled to survive. Even decades later, survivors carried the trauma, passing it down to younger generations. The memory of being uprooted without cause created a collective sense of loss, grief, and caution that shaped entire communities. Despite the hardships, people tried to maintain some semblance of life. Families cultivated small gardens wherever possible, sharing the little food they could grow or barter. People formed social networks within the settlements, helping each other survive, tending to the sick, and teaching children what they could. Yet these efforts were always constrained by scarcity and oversight. Any deviation from the rules, whether for sustenance or culture, risked punishment. Small acts of resistance, speaking in a native language, practicing forbidden customs, preserving books or letters, became essential forms of survival and identity preservation. The long-term consequences of the deportations were profound. Even after some groups were allowed to return to their homelands, they found their villages destroyed, lands redistributed, and infrastructure irreparably damaged. The social fabric of communities was torn apart, and rebuilding took decades, sometimes more than a generation. Cultural memory became intertwined with pain, loss, and resilience. In some regions, the scars remain visible in demographics, settlement patterns, and social structures. The deportations were not merely historical events, they shaped the present in ways that continue to resonate politically, socially, and culturally. Historical records and testimonies reveal the human cost, but the story goes beyond numbers. It is a story of fear, endurance, and survival in the face of a system that treated people as instruments of control rather than citizens. Survivors' memories emphasize that deportation was not about law or justice, it was about dominance, compliance, and the erasure of difference. This understanding transforms the deportations from a mere historical footnote into a lesson about the power of the state and the resilience of those who endured it. Memory serves as both warning and protection. Remembering the deportations, their causes, and their consequences is crucial to understanding the mechanisms of power and oppression. Oral histories, archival research, and memorials ensure that these experiences are not forgotten. They honor those who suffered, those who perished, and those who survived to rebuild their lives. By acknowledging the past, societies can better recognize patterns of injustice and take steps to prevent repetition. The deportations were systematic, methodical, and wide-reaching. Entire nations were uprooted without legal process. Communities lost their ancestral homes. Children were born in exile, and elders died far from the land they loved. The state's control extended into the most intimate spaces of life, dictating movement, labor, culture, and social interaction. Yet through all of this, people found ways to resist quietly, maintain dignity, and nurture hope for a future where they might live freely. Understanding these events requires attention to both the scale and the human dimension. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of individuals were affected. The statistics are sobering, but they do not capture the personal suffering, the daily struggles, and the small acts of courage that sustained life under such conditions. One must consider the lives interrupted, the families divided, the education lost, the health compromised, and the culture disrupted. Every person carried a story, and collectively these stories form a narrative of resilience under oppression.
It is also important to note that these deportations were not isolated incidents. They occurred within a broader context of political repression, social engineering, and border security policies. They reveal the mechanisms by which totalitarian states can exert control over populations, particularly those whose language, religion, or geography make them appear other. By examining these patterns, historians can better understand not only what happened, but why, and what lessons can be drawn about governance, power, and human rights. In reflecting on the deportations, one sees both tragedy and strength. Tragedy in the lives lost, the families separated, the culture disrupted. Strength in the ways communities endured, adapted, and preserved memory. In exile, people continued to speak their language, maintain traditions, and teach the next generation about their history. The resilience of the deported populations is a testament to human endurance and the power of cultural memory to